This is the biggest thing that people ask me about, is what am I supposed to do in the face of a privacy breach? So I've done some work with some privacy committees, and because, for example, again, like Andre was talking about, sometimes you don't have leverage to go fire somebody or take them off the EMR. So I've been working with some teams about how are we going to approach a privacy breach? What are the principles? What is the range of disciplinary action we're going to take? And what are the factors that we are going to consider? So this is my work with a whole bunch of different teams, kind of narrowed down into a couple of slides. So why do you discipline? Is for deterrence. So if people think it's the Wild West and nothing's going to happen if I do something, and we've talked about that at the beginning, like, well, if there are no consequences, who's going to know I was in my sister's chart? Then people go into their sister's charts. So you discipline for deterrence reasons and for accountability reasons, right? So as a team, as an organization, you take responsibility for the actions of the people who have had access to your EMR. And it goes back to your culture of privacy, right? So you want to link your disciplinary response to your culture, right? So that it is embedded, it is part of your expectation that people take it seriously. You also want to have a penalty, right? So that there is an actual, it hurts when you do have a privacy breach. The other reason why you do it is for risk management and to show the privacy commissioner and the courts that you have taken privacy seriously. So if you have, if you can say, you know what, we really don't do anything if there's been a privacy breach, the commissioner will then consider holding you responsible. So if it's just like there's never a consequence, now organizationally you pop up as having some responsibility as opposed to on the individual who went rogue, because organizationally you weren't demonstrating that you were taking it seriously. Another reason why I hear people say they want to discipline is to provide closure to patients. So in your letter, it depends whether you put this in the letter or not, but oftentimes you will say, the person no longer works here. So what does that feel like when you read that letter? First you're like, holy cow, I can't believe they don't work there anymore. But it's also like, there was a consequence for that person. So, and almost always patients will ask you if they lost their job. Well, what happened? What did you do to that person? Right? So from a human resources perspective, often we don't share the disciplinary consequence, but we say we've taken it really seriously and here's all the other things that we're doing to follow up. But one of the things I am finding is when you share information like the person no longer works here, we don't say, it's very rare for me to say they were fired. It has happened. I have put that, so again, in terms of what letters get edited, it is possible the letter gets edited to say the person was fired in a nicer way. But most of the time we say the person no longer works here, and that is then satisfying. But that closure piece for patients in terms of, again, your communications tools and strategies is sometimes very helpful for people to hear. I want you, when you're thinking about your disciplinary protocols, to think about how are you going to evaluate a big, hairy privacy breach and one that's not so bad. So what are the things that you're going to take into consideration? So these are some of what got brainstormed by one of the privacy committees that I was working with. So they wanted to come up with principles. How are we going to approach a privacy breach? The first principle has to be about fairness and consistency. So Andre, you were talking about that, right? As an organization, how do we establish some kind of consistency even though we're all individuals? We want to team-wise communicate a consistent message. Fair, consistent, equitable across the organization. Now for many family health teams, it may not seem quite so equitable because sometimes you will have a consequence for the physicians that is very different from the frontline staff member. So when you have a privacy committee, you can think about, you know what, we do want to actually communicate that if a physician did this, it would be the same penalty as if any other staff member did it. Do you have to do it that way? No, but that might be one of the principles that you think about. You want the discipline to be tied to the gravity of the situation. So it should be reasonable. It's like people don't lose their job because they accidentally went into the wrong chart, but if they went snooping into 139 charts, they're going to be fired. And also for deterrence. So how do you determine what is the worst? What's the big hairy one? And again, we brainstormed, what is the worst kind of privacy breach? Something was intentional or reckless. It was done for a nefarious purpose. It was for personal gain or to harm someone else. You're laughing.
They're bad things.
Yeah, no, that you're thinking about, they're bad things, or?
No, just the words, nefarious.
Yeah, yeah, it's like it's seriously bad. There was actual harm, right? So that would put the weight on it. Or this was a repeat offender. The number of people impacted. That the fact that they received specific training, you eyeballed them, they knew they shouldn't do it, and they did it anyway. Or the sensitivity of the information. So those things may contribute to, like, that's a bigger deal, worse kind of privacy breach. But then you want to think about, is there any mitigating circumstance? So one of the things Tamara was asking is, have you ever heard of a good excuse? Okay, well, these are some of the things, like, what could possibly be a mitigating circumstance? They didn't have training, or there wasn't a policy. So if you organizationally haven't been communicating, then maybe they're not at fault. They didn't appreciate this. It was accidental or an honest mistake. It was a systemic issue. Everybody's doing it, and it happened that they were the one that got caught. But they come to you and they're like, look, if you're going to fire me about this, you're basically firing the entire group, because every single person does this exact same thing. Which is not an excuse, but it might take into account, okay, if we fire that person, that means we're going to have to fire everybody, and we can't fire everybody, so what is our response going to be? Mistaken consent. I really thought I had consent. Breach of policy, not breach of legislation. Or there's been a new development in the law, and they just didn't appreciate, oh my gosh, I had no idea that was now illegal. That's new. So those are some of the mitigating circumstances.
Do any of those get the person off?
Probably not off all the way. Like, there still will be a consequence to them. But for example, if somebody is very unwell, so they are physically or mentally unwell, and it has, you're like, so I hear this all the time. I would have never guessed Kate would do this. But actually, there has been something like Kate had a psychotic break or a mental illness that had happened, and it led to activity that would have never otherwise happened. It might be that you then have to accommodate that person for a mental disability, and maybe they don't get fired for the privacy breach because it was actually related to their being mentally unwell. Now another.
But they might have a leave of absence.
Yeah, and then they would get a leave of absence, or they would have some kind of, they might need some assistance. This is a big one, and this might get them off. Acting on the instruction of senior staff. My physician said it was totally okay for me to take that USB key home. In fact, she told me I had to take this work home. She gave me the USB key. Yes, I lost the USB key on the way, but actually she told me I had to take that information off site and work on it from home. So when and you're like, oh my, you're in violation of our policy. Yeah, but they were doing it on the instruction of somebody who had otherwise had authority on your team. Near misses, so you may not punish somebody for something that was amiss. So every time I do privacy officer training, somebody asks me about, can we have an amnesty? Meaning, if somebody comes forward and says, I need to fess up, I did these things, but I didn't know it was a problem, do you have to act? Do you have to fire them? There is no such thing as an amnesty. So now, except it may mean, wow, that person did come forward, like I do know what my responsibilities are, I can actually now respond to that. It may mean that they have a lesser penalty, but it doesn't mean that wasn't a privacy breach. So if somebody comes forward and says, I've been looking at my kids' records, I didn't know it was a problem, that doesn't mean that wasn't a privacy breach. It is a privacy breach. You have to respond to it. It might mean that they don't get fired. Being contrite, having insight, or showing remorse, or if the breach involved very minimal information.